They found her stores, the scout said, and those 3 words changed everything. Alpha King Calum stood at the edge of the command tent, his silver armor still streaked with the blood of the skirmish that had cost him 40 men and what remained of his supply lines, and he turned slowly to face the trembling scout who had ridden hard through the night to deliver this news. The borderlands stretched before them in every direction, a wasteland of cracked earth and dying trees that the royal cartographers had labeled on their maps with a single damning word: forgotten. Calum had always known that word was a choice. A decision made by his father and his father's father to redirect resources toward the fertile Central Territories and leave the border communities to manage on their own. He had always told himself he would change that. He had simply not yet found the time. Now, standing in the middle of a military disaster with 3,000 warriors facing starvation within days and a rival Alpha's siege cutting off every supply route back to the capital, he understood that time had run out long before he noticed it was passing. Hidden stores, the scout continued, his breath still ragged from the ride. Underground. Whole networks of them, Your Highness. Root vegetables, dried grains, preserved meats. Enough to feed the army for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if rationed carefully. And that is not the strangest part. He paused, and Calum's general, a hard-faced woman named Commander Ressa, who had served the crown for 30 years, made a sharp gesture with her hand that meant get to the point before I lose my patience. The strangest part, the scout said, is that the soil here should not support any of this. The borderlands have been barren for 2 generations. The earth is wrong here, Your Highness. Too much clay, too little water, the wrong mineral balance. Nothing should grow. And yet, he pulled a cloth bundle from inside his coat and laid it on the map. Table, unwrapping it to reveal 3 large root vegetables, each one perfect, each one dense and heavy with nutrients, each one smelling faintly of something Calum could not name, something clean and ancient and deep as stone. Commander Ressa picked one up and turned it over in her hands. "This is not possible," she said flatly, which from Ressa was the equivalent of most people dropping to their knees in shock. "Where did these come from?" Calum asked. His voice was quiet. He had learned a long time ago that quiet voices carried more weight than loud ones, at least in rooms where everyone was already afraid. "A farm at the eastern edge of the settlement, Your Highness. A small place, barely visible from the road. The woman who lives there tried to hide when our scouts approached, ran for the trees. They had to chase her." The scout hesitated. "She is not cooperative. Bring her to me," Calum said. "If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one." Lena had always been good at running. It was, she reflected as the soldiers dragged her through the camp, with her wrists bound in front of her and her boots leaving furrows in the dirt, perhaps her most consistently useful skill. She had been running from something or other for most of her 23 years. Running from the other children who called her Dirt Girl and Grave Witch when she was small. Running from the elders of the settlement who watched her gardens with narrowed eyes and muttered about things that were not natural. Running from the memory of her mother's voice saying, "Please, Lena, you must never let anyone see what you can do. They will not understand it. They will fear it, and fear always turns to cruelty in the end." Her mother had been right about that, as she had been right about most things, and the fact that Lena had failed to heed the warning did not make the warning any less correct. She had been careful. She had been so careful for so long. The underground stores had seemed safe. She had built them over 5 years, filling them slowly, disguising the tunnel entrances beneath old root structures and fallen trees, feeding her neighbors quietly and without explanation, letting people believe the food came from distant traders rather than from her hands and her secret and the strange, warm conversation she had always been able to hold with the earth beneath her feet. But 3,000 soldiers had apparently found the tunnels anyway, and now she was being hauled through the largest military encampment she had ever seen, and the soldiers around her smelled of blood and exhaustion, and the particular grim desperation of people who have been told that their options are very limited. And Lena understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful that this was the moment her mother had always warned her about. The moment when the fear arrived. She held her head up as they walked her through the camp. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cringe. She had learned that much, at least, from years of being underestimated. The command tent was larger than Lena's entire house. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was the man standing at the map table, and her feet stumbled slightly because she had not expected him to look like that. She was not sure what she had expected. Cruelty, perhaps, or the casual indifference of someone who considered the border territories an inconvenience rather than a home. She had heard stories about Alpha King Calum. Everyone in the Borderlands had heard stories. He was said to be cold, brilliant, ruthless in battle and politics alike, a man who had consolidated more power in 5 years of rule than his father had managed in 30. She had imagined someone older, harder, more visibly calculating. Instead, she found a man who was perhaps 30 years old at most, tall and broad-shouldered in the way of all. Like in royalty, with dark hair pushed back from a face that was striking rather than handsome, all strong lines and controlled expression, and eyes the color of storm clouds that were looking at her right now, with an attention so focused it felt like pressure against her skin. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, and met that gaze directly because she was Lena of the eastern Borderlands, and she had been looking men in the eye since she was 12 years old, no matter who they were. "You ran from my scouts," the king said. "Your scouts arrived with weapons drawn," Lena replied. Running seemed sensible. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled than that, but adjacent to it. "What is your name?" "Lena. My father was called Aldrin. He farmed this land until he died, and I have farmed it since. The soil here cannot support the stores we found," Commander Ressa said from the king's right side, her voice carrying a particular weight that suggested this was a statement designed to provoke rather than inform. Which means either you have been trading with outside sources, which in the Borderlands would require resources you clearly do not have, or something else has been happening on that land. Something that should not be possible. Lena looked at the commander for a long moment. She thought about her mother's voice. She thought about the years of careful hiding, the early mornings when she would press her palms to the earth and feel it respond to her like a living thing learning to trust. The quiet satisfaction of seeing her neighbors fed when the official supply routes had once again failed to deliver. She thought about the fact that she was currently standing in a military camp with her wrists bound while an army prepared to take everything she had built. "I worked hard," she said. "My father taught me methods that others do not use. I am good at what I do." "That is not an answer," Commander Ressa said. "It is the only answer I have for you," Lena said calmly. The king was still watching her. That focused gaze had not moved from her face since she entered the tent, and Lena found it difficult to understand what it meant. Nobles usually looked through people like her. People from the Borderlands. People with rough hands and plain clothes, and no family name worth mentioning. People who occupied the lowest possible rung of pack society. The ones close to Omega in status though not formally designated. The ones who existed in the spaces between the hierarchies that the powerful spent so much time constructing. She was accustomed to invisibility. This was something else entirely. "Your stores will feed my army," Calum said. It was not a question. "I noticed that your army was already in the process of taking them," Lena said. "Yes." He did not apologize for this. She had not expected him to. "I will compensate you fairly. I will also need you to tell me where the other stores are. My scouts found one network. I do not believe it is the only one." Lena felt the careful architecture of 5 years of quiet work trembling under the weight of this conversation. "There are people in this settlement who depend on those stores," she said. "They have depended on them for years because the official supply routes have not reached us in a very long time. If you take everything, they will starve this winter." "I am aware," Calum said, and something in his voice shifted when he said those 2 words. Something that sounded unexpectedly like guilt. "I will replace what my army uses. You have my word as Alpha King." "With respect, Your Highness," Lena said, "the word of the Alpha King has not reached the eastern borderlands before. I am not certain how much weight to give it." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when someone says something true, in a room where truth is not particularly comfortable. Commander Ressa made a sharp sound that might have been surprise or might have been suppressed laughter. The king's storm-gray eyes had not left Lena's face, and she held his gaze and did not look away, because she was telling the truth, and she had learned that people who are telling the truth do not need to look at the floor. "You are right," Calum said quietly, "and I cannot argue with you. So instead I will offer you something better than a word. I will offer you a choice. Help me understand what you have done with this land. Help me feed my army through the siege, and I will stay. I will not leave when the military situation resolves. I will personally oversee the restoration of the Borderlands supply routes, and I will do it with whatever resources are required to make it last." He paused. "Or you can refuse, and my army will take what it needs regardless, and I will leave when the siege is over, and things will continue as they have been. I am not asking for the information because I need it. I am asking because I want to do this correctly, and I cannot do it correctly without your help." Lena stared at him. She had prepared herself for many things: threats, demands, casual dismissal. She had not prepared herself for honesty. It was, she thought with a distant kind of wonder, a deeply unfair tactic. "I need to think about it," she said. "You have until morning," Commander Ressa said. "I will need until morning," Lena agreed, and meant it in a different sense entirely. She was given a tent of her own, which surprised her. She had expected a cell, or at minimum a corner of the medical tent, where someone could watch her. Instead, she was shown to a small but clean space at the edge of the officer encampment, with a cot and a lantern, and a bowl of something warm that smelled like actual food, rather than the desperation stew she had been eating for the past 2 weeks. A soldier was posted outside. She understood this was as much to keep her in as to keep others out. But the consideration was there, and she found herself noticing it in the way she noticed all small things, which was to say, with the attention of someone who had learned that small things were frequently the ones that mattered most. She sat on the edge of the cot and pressed her hands flat against the ground through the tent floor and felt the earth breathe beneath her palms. This was what she always did when she needed to think. The land had been her constant when nothing else had been, and even here, in the middle of a military camp on ground that had been churned up by thousands of boots and the hooves of cavalry horses, she could feel the deep, slow heartbeat of it, the patient mineral consciousness that had no opinions about kings or sieges or the politics of werewolf hierarchies, only the long memory of rain and root and stone. She thought about what the king had said. She thought about the way he had looked at her while saying it. She thought about the guilt in his voice when he acknowledged what everyone in the Borderlands already knew, which was that the crown had forgotten them a very long time ago. She could refuse. The army would take the stores, yes, but it would not take all of them, because her most carefully hidden reserves were places that no scout would find without knowing what to look for, and she could keep her neighbors fed through the winter and hope that the military situation resolved itself before spring planting season. The king would leave. Things would continue. And nothing would change, which was the thing that frightened her more than any military camp. Or she could trust him. And that, Lena thought, pressing her fingers deeper into the cold earth and feeling it press back with the steady warmth it always offered her, was the real risk. Not the army. Not the political situation. Not even the exposure of her gift, though that sat heavy in her chest like a stone she had been carrying for years. The real risk was trust, and whether it could be given to a man who had, until 3 days ago, not known her name or her settlement, or the fact that 300 people depended on the small miracle she had been quietly performing in the Borderlands for the past 5 years. She made her decision before dawn. She was not sure, thinking about it afterward, whether she had made it with her mind or with her hands in the earth. Perhaps it did not matter. She found the king before breakfast, standing alone at the edge of the camp, where the military boundary met the Borderlands proper, looking out over the cracked and scarred landscape with an expression she could not quite categorize. He heard her approach before she reached him, which was not surprising. All alpha wolves had exceptional hearing, and lichen royalty in particular were said to be able to detect a heartbeat at 50 paces. She did not try to be quiet. She walked to stand beside him, and looked out over the same landscape he was looking at, the hard pale dirt and the scrubby trees and the distant line of hills that marked the eastern edge of the territory, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "I will help you," Lena said, "on 2 conditions. Name them. The food stays proportional. Your army takes what it needs, and what it takes is documented and replaced. Not someday. Within the month. I want it in writing, and I want Commander Ressa to sign it, because she seems like someone who keeps her word out of personal principle rather than political convenience." A brief pause. "And the second condition? You actually look at this place," Lena said. "Not the military maps, not the resource assessments. You walk through the settlement with me and you look at the people who live here and you understand what it has cost them to survive for 2 generations without support. And then when you leave, you carry that with you. You do not get to forget it again." Calum turned to look at her then, and she felt the weight of that attention again, the focused quality of it. That was different from anything she had experienced before. Wolves could feel the rank of other wolves. It was a visceral thing, a pressure in the air, the particular way that an alpha's presence registered against the skin of everyone lower in the hierarchy. Calum was the alpha king, and she was as close to Omega as a wolf could be, while still carrying a rank at all, and the difference between them should have felt like standing in a gale. Instead, it felt like something she could not name, something that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, as if she was something he had not expected to find. "Agreed," he said. Just like that? She had expected negotiation, conditions on the conditions, the kind of elaborate, careful back and forth that she associated with political arrangements. "Just like that," Calum said. "You are asking for honesty and accountability. These are not difficult things to agree to. They are only difficult to practice." She walked him through the settlement that afternoon. She had sent word ahead, and her neighbors had emerged from their houses with the particular wariness of people who have learned that official visits rarely result in improvement. Old Dana, who had lost 3 grandchildren to the fever 2 winters ago when the medical supplies did not arrive. The Harrow brothers, who farmed the western plots and had been supplementing their official harvest with Lena's secret stores for 4 years, though they had never asked directly where the food came from. Children who had grown up understanding that the king lived in a place called the capital, which was very far away, and was where the good things went before any of them reached the borderlands. Calum walked through all of it, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression composed. But his eyes moved over everything with that focused, attentive quality, cataloging and recording. And Lena watched him watch her people, and felt something complicated unfold in her chest that she had absolutely no name for. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. Lady Seraphine arrived on the 4th day. Lena heard about it before she saw it, because news traveled fast through a military camp, and the arrival of the king's betrothed with a personal retinue of 30 attendants and a caravan of supply wagons was not the kind of thing that went unannounced. She was watching from the roof of the old granary at the edge of the settlement when the procession came through the camp gates, and even from a distance, Seraphine was extraordinary. She was the daughter of the Western Alpha, old blood and old money, and the kind of beauty that had been cultivated across generations like a very intentional garden. All pale gold hair and perfect posture, and a grace that suggested she had been taught to move as though every surface she stood on was a stage. She was exactly the kind of woman who was supposed to stand beside an Alpha King. Lena understood this completely and objectively, and with no particular emotion attached to it, and then spent the remainder of the afternoon being faintly irritated in ways she chose not to examine. She had been working with Calum for 3 days by the time Seraphine arrived, and in those 3 days several things had happened that Lena had not anticipated. He had, for instance, turned out to be an extremely attentive student. She had taken him into the hall, first of the underground store networks, with a lantern and a great deal of internal apprehension about showing someone her work for the first time in 5 years. And he had moved through the tunnels with a general's tactical eye, asking questions about structural integrity and air circulation and the drainage systems she had built to keep the stores dry through the seasonal rains. And his questions had been the right ones, the ones that showed he was understanding the engineering rather than simply cataloging the contents. He had asked about the soil work too, carefully, in a way that acknowledged what he already suspected without pressing her to confirm it. And she had been grateful for the restraint, even as she had been unsettled by the perception behind it. She had also, more dangerously, started to look forward to the mornings. There was a particular quality to the time just after dawn in the Borderlands, when the light came over the eastern hills at an angle that turned even the hard pale dirt briefly golden, and she had always spent those hours alone in her fields because that was when the earth was most communicative, still cool from the night and not yet shut down by the heat of the day. On the second morning, Calum had appeared at the edge of her primary plot while she was working, and stood there with his hands in his pockets, which was the most informal she had seen him, watching her work without interrupting. On the third morning, he had arrived earlier and brought 2 cups of something hot from the camp kitchens, setting one on the fence post nearest to where she was working, and they had drunk in silence for a while and then talked. And the talking had been easy in the way that morning conversations sometimes are, loose and without agenda, moving from the practical details of the soil restoration work to other things, to the histories of the territories and the strange gaps in Lena's formal education and the particular loneliness of borders in general. The way places that existed between things were always somehow expected to be sufficient unto themselves. Calum had spoken about the capital with a detachment that surprised her, as though describing a place he administered rather than a place he loved, and she had tucked that detail away without examining it too closely. None of this was helped by Seraphine. The lady found her way to Lena within hours of arriving, which Lena suspected was not an accident. She came to the fields with 2 of her attendants, dressed for travel in riding clothes that still managed to look as though they had been made specifically for looking at rather than moving in. And she watched Lena work with an expression of careful pleasantness that carried underneath it the particular sharpness of someone doing an assessment. "You are the one who has been helping my betrothed," she said. And she said my betrothed the way certain people said my territory, with a casual weight that was designed to establish ownership without appearing to try. "I have been helping the army," Lena said, not looking up from the soil analysis she was conducting on the eastern slope, her hands buried to the wrist in the ground, while she read the mineral content through her fingers. "The fact that the king is attached to the army is incidental." "How modest," Seraphine said. There was something in her voice that was almost admiration and entirely something else. "Calum speaks highly of you." Lena did look up. At that, because she could not quite control the reflex. Seraphine was watching her with bright, intelligent eyes, and that pleasant expression that did not quite reach them. And Lena understood with sudden clarity that this woman was considerably more formidable than she had allowed herself to consider. "He is generous," Lena said. "He is perceptive," Seraphine said, which was subtly different. "He does not speak highly of things that do not deserve it. It is one of the qualities I have always appreciated in him." She paused, looking over the fields, with a gaze that was almost as attentive as Kylam's, though calibrated differently. "These lands are extraordinary," she said, and this at least seemed entirely genuine. "What you have done here is extraordinary. You should not be hiding in the Borderlands." "I am not hiding," Lena said. "I am home." Seraphine looked at her for a long moment, and something passed through her expression that Lena could not quite read. "Yes," she said, quietly. "I can see that." She paused again. "Be careful, Lena of the eastern Borderlands," she said. "The people who draw maps are always surprised when the territories on the edges of the map turn out to have centers of gravity." And then she walked away with her attendants, and Lena sat in the dirt with her hands in the earth and tried to understand what had just happened. The conversation with the council came on the 5th day, which was also the day the siege pressure began to ease for the first time since Calum's army had arrived in the Borderlands. Lena gathered from the general relief moving through the camp that something had shifted in the military situation. Some intelligence gained or supply route opened that suggested the worst of the crisis might be managed. She heard this news with a part of her mind that was tracking external events and filed it under the category of things that would affect her in ways she could not yet predict, because she had learned a long time ago that when armies stopped needing things, the terms of agreements tended to shift. The council was 4 men and a woman, all of them advisors to the crown, all of them having arrived with Seraphine's caravan. They met with her in the command tent, without Calum, which she noted immediately, and which she suspected was intentional. The woman, whose name was Advisor Marin, and who had the particular clipped efficiency of someone who considered directness a virtue, laid out the situation without preamble. The Crown had an interest in Lena's methods. The Crown wished to understand the source of her ability to produce food from land that should not support it. The Crown was prepared to offer her a position at the capital, with resources and a formal title and the opportunity to apply her methods to the restoration of multiple territories that had suffered similar deterioration. The Crown was also prepared, if she was unwilling, to conduct a more formal inquiry into her activities, which would involve a full investigation of her methods and their origins, and which would be conducted according to the laws governing unregistered supernatural abilities. Lena sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt very calm. This was, she thought, the part her mother had always warned her about. Not the fear exactly, but the institutional version of it, the way power dressed itself in procedure and law and made the threat sound like an offer. I do not have unregistered supernatural abilities, she said. I have good technique and 5 years of careful observation. That is one interpretation, Advisor Marin said. It is the only interpretation I am prepared to discuss with the Crown's advisors, Lena said. If the king wishes to discuss the matter directly, I am available for that conversation. The council exchanged glances. She watched them do it and did not fill the silence. She went looking for Calum afterward and found him in his tent, going over military maps with, Commander Ressa. Both of them bent over a table covered in papers and talking in low voices with the focused shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to communicate in half-sentences. Ressa looked up when Lena entered, and her expression was not quite readable, which from Ressa Lena had begun to understand meant something like respect. Calum looked up a moment later, and his gaze moved over her face with that focused attention, and then sharpened slightly, the way a wolf's hearing sharpens toward a particular sound. What happened? He asked. Your advisors came to see me, she said. Without you. Something moved through his expression that was unmistakably anger, though it was the controlled kind, the kind that sat beneath the surface rather than breaking through it. He said nothing to her immediately, turning instead to Commander Ressa and saying something in a low voice that Lena did not catch, to which Ressa nodded once and left the tent. Then he turned back to Lena and said, Tell me exactly what they said. She told him. She told him all of it, the offer and the implied threat, and the careful way it had been framed to sound like concern rather than coercion. And she watched his face while she spoke and saw the anger become something harder and more settled, the kind of emotion that does not dissipate, but instead becomes a decision. I am sorry, he said when she finished. That was not authorized. I had asked them to wait. Why were they coming at all? Lena asked. He was quiet for a moment. She had noticed that he did this, took the time to find the accurate answer rather than the convenient one, and she had come to expect it as a characteristic rather than a strategy. Because what you can do is extraordinary, he said finally, and the people around me are trained to see extraordinary things as resources to be acquired or threats to be neutralized. I am still working on training them out of it. He paused. Your ability. I need you to know that I have no intention of compelling you to use it, or to explain it, or to make it available to the Crown in any way that you have not freely agreed to. What you do with your gift is yours to decide. It is not a gift, Lena said, before she could stop herself. It is more complicated than that. I know, Calum said. And then, very carefully, I know more about ancient bloodlines than my advisors understand. The founders of the werewolf kingdoms did not simply claim territory. They were bound to it. The earth recognized them and responded to them, and they to it. And that was the source of a pack's health, the old health. Before the political hierarchies got complicated and people started confusing administrative authority with actual sovereignty. He stopped. I am not supposed to know this. My father considered it embarrassing, old mythology that did not fit the modern framework. But I studied it. He looked at her steadily. The founders' lines did not disappear. They went into the margins, the edges. Lena's hands felt very still. You think I am descended from a founder line, she said. I think the earth has been answering to you for a very long time, Calum said. And I think that is not a coincidence. And I think whatever you carry in your blood is considerably older and more significant than my advisor's interest in agricultural productivity. And I did not want them near you until I had spoken to you first. The silence between them after that was different from the previous silences. It had a different texture, a different weight. Lena sat down on the edge of a campaign chair because her legs had decided without consulting her that standing was no longer strictly necessary, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and felt the earth very distantly through the tent floor, steady and patient, and still as it always was. And she thought about her mother's voice saying, "You must never let anyone see what you can do." And she thought about the fact that this man had just described, in quiet, accurate detail, the thing she had spent her entire life believing was a secret. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I suspected when I saw the roots," he said. "The ones my scout brought back. No ordinary cultivation technique produces that. I was certain by the second morning when I came to watch you work." He paused. "You were talking to the field. Very quietly. I could not hear what you were saying, but the ground responded. I watched it. Respond." She should have been frightened. She had spent 23 years being frightened of this exact moment. Instead, she found that she was something else entirely. Something she did not have an immediate word for. Something that sat in her chest, where the old fear used to live and had a warmth to it that was entirely unfamiliar. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The claiming ceremony was not supposed to happen for another 3 weeks. It was the central ritual of the military campaign, the formal acknowledgement of the territories that fell under the Alpha King's protection, and in the context of the Borderlands campaign, it was supposed to be a political event, a statement to the rival faction that the king was committed to defending his borders. Lena had been told about it in passing, and had understood it as something that happened around her, rather than to her. She had been wrong. She learned this on the 8th day, when Commander Ressa came to find her in the fields and said, with the particular direct economy that Lena had come to associate with the commander's version of compassion, "There is a situation involving the ceremony. I think you should know about it before it becomes a surprise." She told Lena about the tradition that governed claiming ceremonies, which was old and rooted in the same mythology that Calum had described in his tent. The understanding that territory claimed by a king was claimed, not just militarily but spiritually, and that in territories with active founder bloodlines, the ceremony required the acknowledgement of the bloodline holder. Seraphine's father, the Western Alpha, had apparently done some very thorough genealogical research since arriving in the camp. Research that had been commissioned the moment the impossible harvest stores became public knowledge, and the research had returned results that the Western Alpha considered deeply inconvenient, and Lena considered more than slightly terrifying. "My bloodline," Lena said. She said it very steadily. "The research suggests it is the original Borderlands founder line," Ressa said. "Unbroken. Going back 6 generations to before the current territorial divisions. Which means that any claiming ceremony conducted in this territory requires your participation to be valid." She paused. and that any alliance formed with this territory carries the implication of an alliance with the bloodline holder. Another. Pause. This one with more weight behind it. Which is why the Western Alpha is currently in Calum's tent, arguing very loudly that the entire situation should be handled differently. He means Seraphine should be in my place, Lena said. He means his family's alliance with the crown was negotiated without knowledge of this complication, Ressa said carefully. He considers it a breach. She looked at Lena with eyes that had seen 30 years of royal politics and appeared to have made a personal peace with most of it. I am telling you this because the king asked me to tell you before you walked into it blind. He is managing the political situation. But he wanted you to have the information. Lena went to find Calum. She found him outside the tent, not inside it, standing a deliberate distance from the argument that was apparently ongoing within. And he turned when he heard her coming with a look on his face that was difficult to catalog. There was something in it that she had seen in pieces over the previous days, the careful focused attention, the quality of his awareness of her that registered differently from the way he was aware of everything else. But it was all assembled now in a single expression that was somehow both composed and completely unguarded. And she stood 3 feet from him and looked at him and felt something that had been very quietly building in her chest for 8 days arrive suddenly and completely in a way that made breathing feel slightly complicated. You knew, she said, about the ceremony. I suspected, he said. Ressa confirmed it this morning. And the Western Alpha. Is very upset, Calum said. He has been very upset since he arrived. I find his upset increasingly irrelevant. He looked at her steadily. I want you to understand something, Lena. The claiming ceremony, the political implications, the complication of what your bloodline means for the territorial alliance. All of that is real, and all of that is happening. But none of it is the reason I want you to stand with me in that ceremony. She felt very still. What is the reason? She asked. You know what the reason is, he said. I think you have known it for at least 3 days. I think you have been being careful about it, which is something I have noticed about you, that you are careful with things that matter to you. He took a step toward her, and she held very still, because the alpha pressure of his presence was doing something entirely different now from what it had ever done before. Not pressure at all. Something more like a warmth that pulled rather than pushed. Something that the wolf part of her recognized before the human part caught up. The mate bond does not care about politics, he said. I am sorry about that, in the sense that it would be more convenient for everyone if it did. But it does not. It found what it found, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. You are the Alpha King, Lena said. Her voice was steady. She was rather proud of it. I am a border farmer with no rank and no family name, and an unregistered supernatural ability that your advisors want to put in a report. I am aware of all of those things, Calum said. I am also aware that you fed 300 people for 5 years without asking for anything. I am aware that you told me the truth about my own failures on the first day we met without flinching. I am aware that you talk to the earth, and the earth talks back, and that whatever ancient power lives in you has been doing the quiet work of keeping this territory alive, while the crown that was supposed to protect it was too busy to notice. He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth that radiated from him, the lichen warmth that was deeper than human body heat, something that came from whatever was at the center of a wolf and reached outward. I noticed, he said. I am not going to stop noticing. Lena looked at him. She thought about running. She was good at running. Then she thought about 8 days of mornings, and the careful way he had held his anger when the council frightened her, and the way he had described her gift not as a resource to be acquired, but as something that belonged to her, and the steadiness of the earth under her hands at 4 a.m, when she had pressed her palms to the ground, and felt it breathe, and thought about trust, and whether it could survive the distance between a king and a border farmer. This is not going to be simple, she said. No, he agreed. It is not. The Western Alpha will not accept it easily. The Western Alpha does not get a vote on who I choose, Calum said. And there was something in his voice then that was entirely Alpha King, the weight of absolute authority wrapped around the personal statement underneath, and Lena felt it register against her skin and understood that he meant it completely. Seraphine's family will be compensated fairly for the disruption to their political plans. Seraphine herself told me yesterday evening that she had expected something like this would happen, which I suspect means she is considerably more perceptive than her father. He paused. She also said to tell you that she hopes you will not waste the opportunity. Her exact words. Lena stared at him. She said that. She said that, he confirmed. She also said she intends to conduct all future correspondence with you directly, which I believe means you have somehow acquired Lady Seraphine's respect, which is not a small thing. I have absolutely no idea how that happened, Lena said. You told her the truth, Calum said. She mentioned it. She said you were the first person in the camp who had spoken to her as though she was a person, rather than a political arrangement. Something moved through his expression, quiet and complicated. We have that in common, she and I. The experience of being treated primarily as an arrangement. Lena thought about the way he had spoken about the capital, the detachment in his voice when he described it, the absence of affection. She thought about a man who had grown up being prepared to be a king, every relationship mediated by what it could strategically provide, every conversation carrying the weight of what was being negotiated beneath it. She thought about what it might mean to be looked at, truly looked at, by someone who was only interested in what was actually there. The ceremony, she said. In 3 days. He said. Tell me what it requires of me, she said. All of it. The actual requirements, not the simplified version. He told her. It took a while. She listened to all of it with her hands quiet in her lap, and then she sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight and the shape of it. And then she said, All right. He looked at her. All right, he said. And there was something in his voice that she suspected was not usually there. Something that sounded like uncertainty. Like a man who had prepared himself for negotiation and found himself on the other side of it unexpectedly quickly. I will need appropriate clothing, she said. I do not own anything suitable for a claiming ceremony. That can be arranged, he said. And I will need someone to explain the full protocol to me in advance because I will not walk into something I do not understand. Of course. And I want Commander Ressa to walk through the security arrangements with me personally, because I do not entirely trust the Council's version of events, and Ressa has not lied to me yet. I will tell her, he said, and the thing in his voice was still there, that quality she did not have a name for, though she was beginning to form one. It sounded something like relief, the particular relief of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has just been offered help with it. Also, Lena said, because she believed in complete honesty, and because the earth under the tent floor was doing something warm and insistent that she was not going to be able to ignore much longer. I am aware of the mate bond. I have been aware of it since the second morning. I have been being careful about it. I know, he said. I am going to keep being careful about it, she said. For a while. I would like to understand who you are before I stop being careful. That seems entirely reasonable, Calum said. I would like the same. He paused. Though I should tell you that the bond has apparently decided the question already, as far as it is concerned. The bond can wait, Lena said. The bond has the patience of the earth. He smiled then. It was the first time she had seen him actually smile. Not the controlled, almost expression she had catalogued before, but an actual smile. And it changed his face in a way that made her feel slightly unsteady, in a manner she chose not to examine too closely. I suspect you are right, he said. The 3 days before the ceremony passed in, a kind of suspended state that Lena experienced partly as preparation and partly as something else, something that did not have a practical category. She spent her mornings in the fields, which had become a shared time without it ever being formally established as one. And Caleb joined her on all 3 mornings with coffee from the camp kitchen, and an increasingly detailed understanding of what she was doing with the soil, the questions becoming more specific and more accurate as his knowledge grew. She found herself explaining things she had never explained to anyone, the way the earth communicated through temperature and texture, and the particular electrical quality of soil that was alive versus soil that had given up. The slow, patient work of convincing dead ground to remember that it had once been capable of life. He listened to all of it with the same focused attention he gave everything, and she watched his understanding develop, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. The council kept a careful distance. She suspected this was the result of specific instructions. Seraphine's father continued to make his objections known through formal channels, which Lena was told about secondhand, and which she had decided to treat as background noise until they required direct engagement. Seraphine herself came to find her on the 2nd afternoon, not with attendants this time, just alone, and they sat on the fence at the edge of the eastern plot and talked for an hour in the way of 2 people who have each sized the other up and decided the other is worth the effort. Seraphine was, Lena found, considerably more interesting than her first appearance had suggested, sharp and clear-eyed, and carrying her own version of a complicated history with power and expectation, and the management of being desired primarily as an arrangement. They talked about the fields, and about court politics, and about what the Borderlands could become with sustained investment. And at one point, Seraphine said, entirely without bitterness, "I always knew he would find someone unexpected. He has always been interested in the edges of things, the margins. I told my father 3 years ago that any woman who wanted to hold Caleb's actual attention, rather than just his political cooperation, would have to be someone who existed outside the system he had grown up in." She looked at Lena. "I want you to know that my family's political objections are my father's objections, not mine." "What are yours?" Lena asked. "I want it in writing that the Borderlands restoration is fully funded and not contingent on the success or failure of any political arrangement," Seraphine said crisply. "My family's territory borders the eastern Borderlands, and we have always borne the cost of border instability more than the central territories understand. If this region is properly restored, the benefits extend beyond whatever romantic or political developments occur." She paused. "I also want to be kept informed of your research into founder bloodlines. The Western Territories have their own historical complexities in that area, and I believe the information may be relevant." Lena stared at her. "You are extraordinary," she said. "I know," Seraphine said pleasantly. "Most people take too long to notice." The morning of the ceremony arrived gray and cold, with the particular weight in the air that the Borderlands sometimes carried before the seasonal rains. Lena was dressed by 2 of Seraphine's attendants in clothes that had been brought from the caravan specifically for this purpose, a deep green that was the color of growing things, with silver embroidery at the hem and cuffs that turned out, when she looked closely, to be botanical patterns rather than the military or heraldic patterns she had expected. When she asked about this, one of the attendants told her that Lady Seraphine had selected the pattern herself. Lena spent a moment contemplating that information, and then let it settle into the category of things she was grateful for. She was brought to the ceremony circle at the edge of the settlement, where the Borderlands met the first of the forest trees, and she stood at the edge of the circle and felt the earth under her feet respond to her presence in the particular way it always did on significant occasions, a warmth rising through the soles of her feet and up through her legs, a greeting, or perhaps a recognition. The land, knowing who was standing on it, and why. The entire army was assembled. 3,000 wolves and their officers, Commander Ressa at the front, with her arms crossed and her expression composed, the advisors in their formal robes looking variously resigned and watchful, the Western Alpha standing at a pointed distance with his jaw set and his face controlled. Seraphine was positioned near the front of the assembly, and when Lena's eyes found her, Seraphine gave a single small nod that said several things at once, most of which resolved to, "I see you and you are ready." Caleb was already in the circle. He was in formal armor, the silver and black of the royal lichen line, his alpha rank radiating from him like heat from a fire. And when Lena walked into the circle to stand across from him and their eyes met, the mate bond did something it had been carefully, patiently, steadily not quite doing for the past 10 days. Something that was the equivalent of a door she had been holding closed, simply letting go. She felt it move through her like the earth did, like the warmth of soil remembering rain, like roots finding water in the dark. She held still. She breathed. She looked at the man across from her who had spent 10 days earning what the bond already knew, and she thought about trust and what it cost and what it built, and she let the warmth keep coming. The ceremony required her to speak first. This was the founder tradition, the acknowledgement of the land, before the acknowledgement of the king, and she understood it now in a way she had only understood intellectually before. She knelt and pressed both palms flat to the earth of the circle, the way she had done 10,000 times alone in her fields, and she felt the response come immediately, the deep, warm greeting, and she spoke the words that had been given to her by Commander Ressa's research into the original ritual, the words in the old tongue that predated the current territorial system by 600 years, the words that said, "I am still here, and this land knows me, and I speak for what has been kept alive here." Something happened when she said those words. She felt it happen. The earth under her hands warmed suddenly and intensely, and a sound moved through the assembly that was not quite a sound, more a vibration, a feeling that registered in the chest rather than the ears. And she looked up from her palms and saw that the ground around the ceremony circle was doing something it had never done before. Green was pushing through the cracked pale dirt. Not a metaphor, not a symbol, but actual new growth, thin and bright, and determinedly alive. A ring of it spreading outward from where her palms touched the earth, moving through the circle and past it into the surrounding ground, the land waking up in real time in front of 3,000 witnesses. She heard the sound from the assembled wolves, and it was the sound of people encountering something ancient, something that bypassed the rational mind entirely and spoke to the part of them that was older than language. She heard the Western Alpha make a sound that was entirely stripped of political calculation, just shock, pure and unguarded. She heard Commander Ressa say something very quiet that might have been finally in a voice that suggested it had been a long time coming. Calum stepped forward and offered her his hand, and she took it, and rose, and the warmth of his skin against hers was the mate bond. Completing a circuit it had been patient about for 10 days, and the earth continued to green around them. And she stood in the ceremony circle with the Alpha King's hand in hers, and felt the territory breathe. "I claim this land as under my protection," Calum said, his Alpha voice carrying across the assembled army with the absolute authority of someone stating a fact, rather than making a declaration. "And I acknowledge the bloodline that kept it alive when the crown forgot it. This oversight will not continue." He paused, and his thumb moved once across the back of her hand, and she felt it everywhere. All resources allocated to the Borderlands restoration are effective immediately, binding, and not subject to political negotiation. He looked at the Western Alpha when he said this, which Lena suspected was intentional. "This territory is no longer forgotten. I will remain here through the restoration's initial phase personally, and I will return at intervals until I am satisfied with the progress." Another pause. "Any advisor who attempts to conduct unauthorized negotiations with the bloodline holder of this or any territory will find their position significantly reconsidered." The assembly was very quiet. The green kept growing. Lena looked at the man beside her and thought about the scout arriving with 3 root vegetables and 3 words that had changed everything. And she thought about running, and about morning coffee, and about the way trust felt different from what she had expected it to feel like, less like a decision, and more like a door she had already been standing in front of for a long time, waiting for someone worth opening it for. She thought about her mother's voice saying they will not understand, and she thought about the way the earth under her feet was speaking directly to the question her mother had never been able to answer, which was what happened if someone did. "Your Highness," she said, very quietly, "just for him." "Lena," he said. Just her name, the same way. "The restoration plan," she said. "I have thoughts." He almost smiled, and it was better than almost. "I know," he said. "I have been waiting for you to tell me. It is going to require a significant investment of time. I am aware. And sustained presence," she said. "You cannot administer a recovery from a distance. The land requires attention." "I intend to give it attention," he said. And the way he said it was not entirely about the land, which she understood, and which she chose to receive in the steady way she received everything that came from the direction of ancient and patient things. "I intend to give everything here my full attention, for as long as it requires." The green had reached the edge of the settlement by then, bright and insistent and entirely new, pushing through ground that had been given up on for 2 generations and finding that it had not, in fact, given up. The army was watching. Seraphine was watching with eyes that had a brightness in them that was not quite composed. Commander Ressa was watching with the expression of someone who had waited a long time for something and was quietly satisfied by its arrival. Old Dana from the settlement was standing at the edge of the assembly, and she had her hands pressed to her mouth and tears on her face. And Lena saw her and felt something that was larger than what she had words for, something that was the accumulated weight of 5 years of feeding people, quietly in the dark, and the particular strange grace of having it seen, not despite everything, but because of it. "All right," she said. She held his hand and felt the earth alive under her feet and looked out at the territory that had always been hers in the oldest possible sense. The way things are yours when they recognize you, and you recognize them. The way home is always a truth rather than a location. Let us begin. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? 3 months later, the Borderlands looked like a different place. Visitors from the Central Territories who passed through on the newly restored supply roads stopped and stood at the edges of the fields, with expressions that Lena had come to find quietly satisfying. The particular look of people encountering something that does not fit their existing map of the world. The green had continued spreading from the ceremony circle, slowly and steadily and without drama, the way real growing things spread, through the effort of many hands, and the patient attention of soil learning to trust itself again. There were new crops in the ground and new structures going up, and the medical supply routes were running on schedule, which had produced a moment with old Dana that Lena would carry for the rest of her life. The old woman standing in the supply depot looking at shelves that were full for the first time in years. Not crying. Exactly, but with an expression that was the next thing past tears. Calum had stayed, as he had said he would. He had not disappeared to the capital when the immediate military situation resolved. He had set up a working administrative presence in the settlement, much to the visible irritation of several of his advisors, and he spent his mornings in the fields with Lena, and his afternoons managing the extensive political and logistical work of actually keeping a promise to a forgotten territory, and his evenings writing the kind of correspondence that territorial restoration apparently required in extraordinary volume, which Lena helped him with because she had strong opinions about what the Borderlands needed, and she had discovered that having a partner who listened to strong opinions was something she had not known to want. The mate bond had been allowed to do what it had been doing quietly for 10 days before the ceremony, which was to say, settle into something that was less like an event and more like a state of being. The particular warmth of 2 people who have each taken the time to understand what they are choosing, and have chosen it clearly. Seraphine's family had eventually reached an agreement with the Crown that Lena understood only in its broad outlines, something involving territorial boundaries and trade arrangements that had actually resulted, as Seraphine had predicted, in benefits to the Western Territories from the stabilization of the Borderlands. Seraphine herself had visited twice since the ceremony, and the correspondence between her and Lena on the subject of founder bloodlines and the historical territories had become one of the more interesting threads of Lena's life. A slow-building map of something larger than any single territory, a picture of what the land had always been before power drew lines across it. The council had been reorganized. This was described in official communications as a structural realignment, but everyone understood it. As a consequence of the unauthorized approach to Lena and the subsequent conversation Calum had apparently had with certain advisors that Commander Ressa had described, with the particular satisfaction of someone who was present for it, as the quietest dressing down in the history of the royal court. Advisor Marin was still in her position, but her approach to Lena had altered into something that was not quite respect, and not quite wariness, but sat somewhere usefully between them. Lena still pressed her palms to the earth every morning. She still felt it breathe. She still had the particular conversations with the mineral deep of the soil that she had always had. The exchanges that had no language and required none. The ongoing relationship with something ancient and patient and entirely indifferent to titles or politics, or the elaborate hierarchies that wolves spent so much energy maintaining. The earth did not care whether she was a border farmer or a recognized bloodline holder, or the maid of an alpha king. It cared that she was there and that she was listening, which it turned out was the same thing it had always cared about. She was in the eastern fields on the morning 3 months after the ceremony, when she felt a hand settle lightly on her shoulder, and Calum crouched beside her in the dirt in the good informal way he had developed over 3 months of mornings. And she looked up at him in the early light, with the smell of turned earth around them and the distant green hills and the sky going gold over the eastern edge of the territory, and she felt the mate bond hum quietly between them like the earth's deep warmth, steady and patient and entirely certain, the way old things always are. "The northern sector reports are in," he said. "Better than projected." "I know," she said. "The ground told me this morning." He looked at her for a moment with the focused attention that had not changed in 3 months, the quality of his awareness of her that she had come to understand as one of the most consistent things in her life. "What else did it say?" he asked. "That it is glad to be remembered," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She felt the truth of it move through him the way she felt things move through the earth, deep and without argument. "Tell it," he said, "that the feeling is mutual." She pressed her palms deeper into the morning soil and felt it rise to meet her, warm and alive and entirely awake. And she thought that this was what her mother had not been able to tell her, the thing that came after the fear and after the hiding and after the long patient years of feeding people in secret and hoping the world would someday be different. This was what waited on the other side of being seen. Not the end of the work, but the beginning of doing the work alongside someone. The territory restored and the bond settled and the green growing where the gray had been. The land and the woman and the king all choosing each other in the oldest possible sense, the way things that belong together find their way to the same ground and grow.